When Roberta Colm stepped into the main lobby of Sutherland Development Group's Halifax Tower on a Thursday morning in October and told 140 assembled shareholders that the company's chief executive had paid $150 for her niece, Norman Sutherland was already standing at the front of the room. He had known she was coming. He had known since Tuesday, which was also the day he had submitted a packet of documents to the RCMP's Commercial Crime Division. He watched her make the announcement and said nothing. 11 months earlier, he had been sitting on an overturned lobster trap at the end of Harker's Cove's public wharf, reading a quarterly filing, and that was where he had first noticed Cecily Paige. Harker's Cove sat on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia, 2 hours from Halifax and 40 minutes from anything most people would call a highway. It had 400 residents, 2 churches, 1 gas station that doubled as a hardware store, and a fish processing facility that had been called Paige & Sons since 1981, though the Sons had mostly moved inland and the founder, Frederick Paige, had been in the ground for 14 months. Norman had rented a fisherman's cottage on the far end of Harbour Road in late November. He paid 3 months in advance with a bank draft because he didn't want to explain himself, and the landlord, a retired mechanic named Ted, didn't ask him to. The cottage had a propane heater, a working kitchen, a view of the water, and no reliable cell service past the breakwater, which was the main reason he had chosen it. He wore the same 3 jackets in rotation. He drove a 10-year-old F-150 with rust along the wheel wells and a cracked left mirror he had duct-taped rather than replaced, because replacing it would have required a trip to Dartmouth, and he hadn't been ready to go back to a city yet. The people of Harker's Cove assembled a story about him the way small towns always do, efficiently and from very little. He was a widower. He had lost money on something. He had worked in the trades, maybe electrical, maybe plumbing. He was quiet in the way that either meant grief or pride, and the consensus settled on grief because grief was easier to accommodate. None of it was accurate. Norman let it stand. He had been away from Sutherland Development Group for 11 months. He had handed operational control to Pierce Holden, his executive vice president, before leaving Halifax, and had kept his title and his majority shareholding and nothing else. The instruction to Pierce had been brief: call the one number Norman had given him if the board moved against the founder's interest. Until then, no calls. He had needed to know whether he was worth anything without the machinery that made people careful around him. He hadn't been able to answer that question in Halifax. There were too many people there who had already done the calculation. Cecily Paige was 27. She had come back to Harker's Cove after her father died, intending to stay 2 weeks, and had stayed 14 months because the situation at Paige & Sons had a shape she recognized and couldn't walk away from. Her father's sister, Roberta Colm, had moved into the management office within 6 weeks of the funeral, carrying a document she described as Frederick's wishes, a power of attorney that no one in the family had ever seen or heard mentioned. It was witnessed and notarized and signed in her father's hand, or in something close enough to her father's hand, that Cecily could not say with certainty what she was looking at, only that it didn't look right. She stayed because leaving felt like agreeing. By the time Norman arrived, she was working the processing floor 5 days a week and sleeping in the small apartment above the facility's back office, which had been the foreman's quarters before Roberta had turned the foreman into a redundancy. She was not paid. Roberta explained this as deferred compensation, as a shared family interest, as things being complicated right now, as Cecily needing to understand what it took to run something. The explanation shifted week to week, which was itself an explanation, but not one Cecily could do anything with yet. Norman noticed her the way he had learned to notice things that didn't fit the available explanation. She carried herself like someone who had made a private decision about how much she was willing to show. She didn't complain, and she didn't ask for sympathy. And the one time a delivery driver made a comment about the owner's niece being put to real work, she looked at him until he stopped talking, and then she went back to what she had been doing. Small thing, Norman thought about it for 2 days. Roberta Colm had noticed Norman the way she noticed most things in Harker's Cove, with the particular attention of a woman who had decided to be important in a place that hadn't asked for her. She noted the truck, the jacket, the cottage on Harbour Road. She drew the conclusion the town had already drawn, and then, the way she always did, she went one step further. A man with nothing, she decided, had nothing to lose. She came to Harbor Road on a Wednesday evening in February, wearing a coat that announced itself, and knocked on Norman's door without calling ahead. She didn't introduce herself. She looked at him the way she looked at supply invoices. "I have a situation," she said. She explained it in the tone of someone offering a favor. She had a niece who had overstayed a difficult period. The girl had no money, no plans, and no apparent inclination to make any. She was becoming a problem. Roberta was willing to pay someone to take her off her hands, get her settled somewhere, give her a purpose. $150, she said. "You take her tonight and I don't have to see her standing around my facility looking at me like I owe her something." Norman said he would need to think about it. He thought about it for 2 hours. He stood at his kitchen window and looked at the water, and thought about 11 months of watching people calculate whether he was worth talking to. He thought about a notarized document that hadn't looked right. He thought about Cecily on the processing floor, carrying something she couldn't put down and wouldn't explain. Then he put $150 in his coat pocket and walked to the facility. Cecily had been called to the back office. She came in from the floor still wearing her rubber apron, and she looked at the two of them and understood the shape of the conversations before anyone spoke. Roberta was satisfied with something. The man from the cottage down the road was not. Those were the only legible things in the room. Roberta told her she was leaving tonight, that arrangements had been made, that there was a bag packed in the back hall with her things in it. She said it with the voice she used for decisions that were already settled. Roberta's son Adrian was leaning in the doorway. He was 28 and had come back to Harker's Cove from a sales position in Moncton when his mother had secured the facility, which said something about what kind of man he was. He looked at the situation with visible enjoyment and said, "At the moment designed to land hardest, $150. That's what the position pays, apparently. Less than a decent snowblower." Roberta didn't acknowledge it. She went to the back hall and returned with a duffel bag that she set at Cecily's feet with the flat thud of something closed by someone else's hands. "Everything's in there," she said. "Don't come back here without calling first." Cecily looked at the bag. Her father had spent 31 years building that facility. His name was still on the sign above the main door, in letters that needed repainting. 14 months of staying and watching and waiting, and it compressed to a duffel bag and a number that a stranger in her father's back office had been willing to pay. What landed hardest wasn't the money or Adrian's line. It was the packing. Roberta had gone through her things, had decided what counted as hers. The transaction itself had been a formality. The sentence had been carried out upstairs earlier in the day without Cecily being present for any of it. She picked up the bag herself. No one offered to help, and she wouldn't have permitted it. They walked 4 blocks before Cecily stopped under a streetlight and set the bag down hard enough to make a point. "Why did you agree to that?" she said. Norman turned. He kept his distance, which she noticed. "I didn't buy you," he said. "She'd already decided you were leaving. The $150 was the amount she needed to feel like she controlled the exit. If someone else paid it, the exit happened on her terms instead of yours. I'd rather you had the night." That's not a sensible reason for a stranger to spend $150. "No," Norman agreed, "it isn't." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back without hurrying, the way someone waits for something that will either arrive or won't. "What do you actually want?" Cecily said. "A quiet place to read," he said. "I have that already. The cottage has 2 bedrooms. There's a lock on the second one and I'll show you where it is. You stay until you have wages and somewhere better to put them. That's the whole offer." She counted what she had. $47 in the front pocket of the duffel, a phone on the facility's plan, which meant it would be canceled by morning, one cousin in Cape Breton who had 3 small children and a house that didn't have room for complications. Every road went back through that facility. She understood it standing under that light, and it changed the shape of the night. "The lock works?" she said. "It works," Norman said. The cottage was exactly what he'd described. Small and plain and cold in the way of houses that aren't heated all day. The second bedroom had a bed and a lamp and a chest of drawers and a lock that engaged cleanly. Norman set the duffel inside the door, showed her the thermostat, told her the propane sometimes took a minute to catch. Then he went to the front room and stayed there. Cecily sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on. She had spent 14 months telling herself that patience was a form of strategy. Tonight had proved it wasn't. Patience had bought her a duffel bag and $150, paid by someone she had barely spoken to, and the woman who had done the packing had been so certain of the outcome that the bag was latched before the offer was made. The situation had been resolved without her. That was the thing she couldn't put down. She turned the lock, lay down without undressing, and listened. In the front room a page turned, then another. Whoever he was not at her door. She found work at the Blue Spruce, a cafe 3 blocks from the wharf that Margot Tully had been running for 12 years with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned not to ask unnecessary questions. Margot looked at Cecily's employment gap for about 4 seconds, asked whether she could be there at 6 in the morning, and handed her an apron. The first week, Cecily made $260. She counted it 4 times. It was the first money she had earned since her father died. Roberta had spent 14 months explaining that Cecily had no claim to anything, and the argument had held because Cecily had had nothing of her own to hold against it. $260 was not a legal case, but it was hers, and nobody could file a document that made it disappear. She opened an account at the credit union on Pierce Street and put every dollar in it and withdrew nothing. Norman had his oddities. She filed them the way she filed everything now, sideways. He read financial statements, not news articles about markets, but the actual filings, dense columns of figures that required training to decode and that nobody read for enjoyment. He annotated them in cramped, fast handwriting. Once, wiping down the kitchen table, she saw a margin note beside a line of numbers that read dilution unacknowledged at P47. Ask H about the conversion terms, and she had no idea what it meant except that whoever had written it was not guessing. He knew things a man with a rusted truck had no particular reason to know. When Margot mentioned that her building's new property management company had sent a lease renewal with terms that looked wrong, Cecily repeated it at the cottage that evening, without expecting anything. Norman asked 3 questions about the assignment clause and told her exactly what Margot should insist on in writing before signing. Margot kept her lease. She asked Cecily where the advice had come from. Cecily said a friend, and heard how thin it sounded. He had a sense for certain vehicles, too. Once every few weeks, usually a black SUV moving too slowly for Harbor Road, Norman would stop mid-sentence, look at nothing in particular, and find a reason to be somewhere else in the house. The clearest instance was outside the hardware store in April, when a man in a good coat came around the corner, saw Norman from 20 feet away, and raised his hand with the unmistakable expression of someone who has met an important person once and never forgotten it. Norman turned into the narrow lane beside the building and was gone before the man had closed half the distance. The man stood on the pavement, looking puzzled and faintly embarrassed, the way people do when they've been certain of something and then suddenly aren't. Cecily was standing 40 feet away holding a bag of coffee filters. That evening at the kitchen table, she told him about the power of attorney. She hadn't planned to. She had been in the cottage for 10 weeks and had said nothing about her father or the facility or the document with the signature that didn't look right. It came out in about 6 minutes. The office, the notary, the date, the way the pen had guided the signature rather than driven it. "I've known since November," she said. "Knowing and being able to do anything about it are different problems. She's been very careful about keeping me in a position where I have nothing to stand on." Norman listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question, which was whether her father had used the same solicitor for a long time. 22 years, Cecily said. He nodded slowly and didn't say anything else about it. She asked, "What did you actually do before this?" He closed the report he'd been reading, which she noticed because he usually kept a finger in the page. "A job I don't want to go back to," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He didn't offer more, and she didn't push. She had thought in the early weeks that he was hiding something shameful. By April, she had begun to suspect the opposite, and that was harder to sit with, because a shameful secret would have made him easier to understand. The call came on a Monday evening in the middle of May. Norman's phone was a prepaid thing that almost never rang. He answered it in the front room, listened for perhaps 30 seconds, and said only that he was coming. He was out the door in under 5 minutes. No bag, no explanation, only a flat instruction to lock up behind him. He didn't come back that night, or the next day. By Wednesday afternoon, Cecily had moved from irritated to something she didn't have a name for. She checked the front room. The books were where he'd left them, the filings stacked squarely beside the chair. On the notepad by the door, written fast the evening of the call, a phone number with a Halifax area code. She dialed it from the payphone outside the hardware store. A woman answered on the second ring. Sutherland Development Group, Mr. Holden's office. Cecily held the receiver for another second, then set it back on the hook. Sutherland Development Group occupied 22 floors of glass at the corner of Barrington and Sackville in Halifax. Its name was cut into the granite, facing above the entrance in letters 2 feet high. Cecily had walked past the building on a school trip when she was 19 and had not thought about it since. She drove to Halifax that afternoon in her own car, a 12-year-old Civic she had bought 3 weeks earlier from a retired schoolteacher in Sheet Harbor, because she was done depending on anything she didn't own. The lobby was marble and glass and very cold and full of people who all knew exactly where they were going. She got perhaps 20 feet before the atmosphere in the room shifted. Not with any announcement, just a change in pressure. People at the reception desk straightened and touched earpieces. A line of men and women in dark suits came out of the elevator bank and positioned themselves near the entrance. Outside, a convoy of black SUVs pulled to the curb. Norman got out of the second one. The jacket was gone. Everything about the jacket was gone. He wore a dark charcoal suit that had been cut for the specific width of his shoulders, and he crossed the lobby without slowing, and every person near the entrance moved or fell in beside him. A silver-haired man came to his left shoulder and began speaking rapidly, handing across a folder. Norman took it without looking at the man, opened it while walking, gave an instruction that sent 3 people in a different direction. Cecily heard fragments as the formation moved, the vote, the proxy, before Thursday, and then the silver-haired man. "They'll need to hear it from you directly, Norman." She understood it completely, and all at once. Sutherland Development Group was named after him. Not a grandfather, not an inherited legacy, after him. He was the founder, the controlling shareholder, one of the largest private construction and real estate companies in the country, and he had been absent from public life for nearly a year, and everyone in that lobby knew it. She had been buying his groceries out of shift tips from the Blue Spruce. Norman was 12 feet past her when he stopped. She watched it register, not her face first, something at the edge of his attention that didn't belong to the room. Then the correction, then the turn. The men around him kept walking for 2 full strides before they realized he was no longer with them. He looked at her across the marble floor wearing a suit that had cost more than she had earned in her entire life, and Cecily found that she was not surprised. That was the part that settled hardest. Some part of her had known for weeks and had chosen not to finish the thought, because finishing it would have turned every quiet thing he'd done into a decision made by a man who could afford anything. She turned and walked out through the main doors before he reached her. He came back to Harker's Cove that night. He was wearing the Carhartt jacket again, which she found almost an insult. She let him say all of it. It took most of an hour. His wife had died 3 years earlier, and in the grief that followed, something else had come loose. Not the company, but his ability to tell who was in the room for him and who was in the room for what he represented. The 2 things had become indistinguishable. Friends who turned out to be adjacencies. People who agreed with him in boardrooms and repositioned in hallways. An entire year without a single conversation where the other person did not want something only Norman Sutherland could authorize. After long enough, he said, "You stop being able to tell whether you're worth anything with the business subtracted." That was the thing that had frightened him. He couldn't tell anymore. So he had subtracted it. handed control to Pierce Holden, kept the shareholding and the title, and walked out with a rented cottage and a truck that needed a mirror and no access to the machinery that made people polite to him. 11 months of people meeting a man in old clothes and making their calculation accordingly. Almost all of them had behaved exactly the way people behave when they think they're looking at someone who doesn't matter. Cecily said, "In the meantime, you ran an experiment on a street where I happen to live." Norman said, "I ran it on myself. Harker's Cove was where the cottage was. Roberta was at the gate. You were at the gate." He looked at her steadily across the kitchen table. "You treated me like a person before you knew anything else about me," he said. "I've spent 4 months not saying it because the moment I say it, it starts to sound like something I was owed. I wasn't owed it. I'm only telling you it was the whole of it." Cecily believed him. That was the inconvenient part. She sat in that kitchen and found that every word of it was true, and that it changed nothing about what she was going to do next. 2 weeks later, he offered to help. He laid it out carefully and without pressure. An apartment in Halifax, a position in the company's development office, a retainer with any lawyer she chose. He placed the offer on the table like a man who had spent considerable time making sure it contained no hidden terms, and he looked genuinely puzzled when it wasn't enough. Cecily put both hands flat on the table. "Roberta stood at that door and put a number on me," she said. "If I move into an apartment you pay for and take a position with your name behind it, then she was right, not about the amount, about the kind of thing I am, something that gets handed between people and valued by whoever happens to be holding it at the time." Norman didn't argue. She understood later that he had already known. She kept the second bedroom on Harbour Road. She kept the 6 a.m. shifts. She hired a small firm in Truro with money from her credit union account, paying the retainer herself. It was the Truro firm, not SDG's legal team, that pulled the probate filings. What they found was already in the public record, available at any Nova Scotia courthouse to any member of the public who walked in and asked. 2 property transfers recorded in the 9 weeks after Frederick Paige's death, both notarized by the same individual whose certification had been suspended the following year. The signature on one of the transfers did not match the signature on documents Frederick had filed with the municipality 18 months earlier, and his actual will, the one he had executed with the same solicitor he had used for 22 years, the previous spring before he died, had never been withdrawn. It was sitting in the solicitor's file. It left the facility and its assets to his daughter. Cecily read the summary on a Tuesday evening and didn't move for a long time. She had known since November. She had been standing at the edge of it for 14 months, unable to step across because she had had nothing to stand on. The proof had been in a public file the entire time, available to any adult who could walk into a courthouse and ask. Roberta came to the Blue Spruce on a weekday at the slow hour, dressed in a way calculated to look modest. She waited at a corner table until Cecily came out from the back, and then she performed something she had clearly rehearsed in a parked car. Remorse, grief, a woman overwhelmed after her brother's death, mistakes made under pressure, a family that could still be repaired. Cecily listened to all of it without interruption. Then she asked her to leave. Roberta's face reorganized itself. It happened quickly and without embarrassment, the way someone changes tactics when the first one has failed and the second was always in her pocket. She said, "Let me tell you what the press is going to hear. A wealthy Halifax developer arrived in a small Nova Scotia town and paid $150 to take a young woman off her family's hands." That was the only way to say the facts. She would tell them she had been a grieving woman, frightened, overwhelmed. She would cry on camera, and she was very good at it. She set her card on the table. Come back to the facility. Sign a proper documented arrangement. Everyone's interest protected. The whole matter settled quietly. Do that, and this ends in this room. Then she stood, buttoned her coat, and left, and the door closed, and Cecily sat alone in a cafe at 4 in the afternoon and saw it whole for the first time. She had built something from $260 and a lock that worked. And that gate, Roberta's patience, Roberta's paperwork, Roberta's talent for holding the one thing you couldn't argue against, had followed her the entire distance. Every fact in the threat was true. The money was real. The doorframe was real. All of it could be used to destroy the only person who had ever refused to price her. Cecily kept the card for 3 days. Then she told Norman about the visit that evening, word for word, including the part about crying on camera. She watched him take it in without any change in his face except a small tightening at the jaw. "I can make it go away," he said. "Not by paying her. There are things I can do. I want you to know the option exists." "She doesn't want revenge," Cecily said. "She wants a signature. If I sign anything, everything she did to my father's documents gets covered by my own name. That's what she's actually buying." Norman didn't argue, and she understood he had already known. The 2 weeks ran out on a Friday, and Roberta did exactly what she had promised. The story appeared Saturday morning on a platform that traded in this kind of thing, and it did not read like a rumor. A grieving woman, a vulnerable niece, a prominent Halifax developer who had arrived in a small Nova Scotia town and paid money to take the girl away. Every fact was accurate. That was the engineering of it. Roberta had not invented a single detail. She had only changed who was frightened and who held the door. By Wednesday, $150 was doing all the work on its own, detached from any context. Inside Sutherland Development Group, it moved faster and had sharper edges. Norman had been back at the head of the company for 5 months, and there were people on the board who had grown comfortable in his absence and who now had a phrase they could use in discussions about judgment. The annual shareholder briefing went ahead on schedule because canceling it would have read as an answer. The lobby held 140 people and a standing section of press at the back. Cecily came because staying away would have looked like an admission, and because she had decided somewhere in the last 2 weeks that she was finished letting other people choose the room she stood in. Pierce Holden met them at the private elevator with a phone in each hand and the expression of a man who had been awake since before 5. He told Norman the documents were in the building. Norman nodded once. Roberta arrived at 10 past 10. She came through the main doors alone, having timed it precisely, after the room had filled, before the platform was in use, when nobody yet had authority over the floor. She walked to the center of the lobby, turned to face the room, and said her name and said that the man running this company had paid $150 for her niece. The room came apart. Every phone at the back came up. 3 of Pierce Holden's people moved forward before Norman lifted one hand and stopped them where they stood. Cecily felt the room find her. She leaned toward Norman and offered the only thing she had left. "Let me walk out right now, in front of all of them. The story goes with me." "No," Norman said. He walked to the front of the room. He did not go to the podium. He stood on the open floor at the front of his own lobby, in front of his board and his shareholders, and every camera in the building. "She's telling the truth about the money," he said. "I want that on the record first, because everything I say after it will be verified." Nobody moved. In February, I placed $150 on a doorframe in Harker's Cove. Roberta Colm collected it. Those are the facts, and I'm not going to stand here and qualify them. What she hasn't told you is what the money was for. It was not a price for a person. It was the amount she named to let her niece walk out of a building she controlled. Cecily Paige's father built that facility. She had been living in it without pay for 14 months. Roberta Colm had already packed her bag before I arrived. It was sitting in the back hall, latched, when the conversation began. The only remaining question was whether Cecily's departure looked like an eviction or a sale. Roberta preferred the sale. I let her have it because arguing at 10 o'clock at night would have cost Cecily the night and changed nothing else. He turned slightly, addressing the wider room. In June, I asked our legal group to look at the public probate record on the estate of Frederick Paige, not private documents, public filings, available at any Nova Scotia courthouse to any member of the public who asks. What they found has been submitted to the RCMP's Commercial Crime Unit. He looked at his watch. It was submitted last Tuesday, before Mrs. Colm walked into this building this morning. Roberta's face didn't collapse. It emptied, which was different and more complete. She had walked into that lobby carrying $150 like a blade, certain it was the sharpest object in the room. It was the $150 that had brought her here, that had placed her in front of every camera in the building, insisting that the public examine the transaction closely. She had spent 9 months constructing every reason for people to look carefully at what Roberta Colm had done, and she had done it herself. 2 of Pierce Holden's people walked her out through the revolving doors. She said nothing further. The last thing the cameras caught was a woman in a good coat being guided through the exit without resistance. The legal process took 8 months. Cecily ran all of it through the Truro firm, paying every invoice from her own account. She was offered assistance in writing by SDG's general counsel and declined in writing. When the retainer ran short, she borrowed against the expected settlement rather than take a single dollar from Norman. She wanted the record to show that Cecily Paige had recovered Frederick Paige's estate, not that anyone had recovered it for her. Norman read what she asked him to read. He said nothing about the rest. Adrian Colm separated from his mother in the 2nd month and retained his own lawyer. He produced correspondence and records going back 4 years, material Roberta hadn't known he had kept. Whether he had kept it out of foresight or as insurance against exactly this outcome, Cecily never asked. Whatever had existed between them had been settled at a doorframe in February, with 1 sentence about what a person was for. Roberta was charged with fraud and forgery in connection with the estate. She fought it for 7 months with 3 different lawyers and spent the final weeks arguing procedure. The procedure did not go her way. The Page & Sons processing facility was returned to Cecily's name the following spring, along with the accounts and equipment her father had built across 3 decades. She kept the name above the door and hired a manager with 20 years in the industry, and spent the first year learning everything about the operation that Roberta had spent 14 months preventing her from touching. She didn't go back to the apartment above the back office. She rented a small house on Harbor Road instead, 2 doors down from Norman's cottage. When Margot Tully finally found a buyer she trusted with her staff, Cecily bought the Blue Spruce. She kept every employee. She kept the 6 a.m. opening and kept working the counter 2 mornings a week because she liked knowing whether things were running right. Within 18 months, there were 2 locations, and she managed both from a desk that had belonged to her father. Norman asked the question on an October evening on the wharf, which was probably the wrong place and certainly the wrong season. With the wind coming off the water the way it does in October on the eastern shore, he did it badly for a man who negotiated for a living. He said he wanted her in his life as the person he loved, and that he had waited until she owned something she hadn't gotten from him, because he needed the answer to be what it actually was, rather than what gratitude can sometimes look like from a certain angle. Cecily said yes. Not because of the company or the lobby or the cameras. She had known those things for less than a year and had turned down everything they offered. She said yes because she had chosen him in February on a dark street in Harker's Cove, when he was a man in a worn jacket that an entire town had decided not to look at directly, and he had placed $150 on a doorframe and said nothing about it that made her feel she owed him anything in return. Roberta Colm had believed $150 could establish what a person was worth, that $150 became the exact instrument of her own undoing, the one object she had carried into a room full of cameras and insisted the public examine, not understanding that examining it required looking at everything standing behind it as well. She had judged Norman by the jacket. She had judged Cecily by a number. She had looked at both of them and seen only what she expected to find, and she had done it loudly and in front of witnesses and without once considering that she might be wrong about any of it. 3 years after that February, Cecily Paige had her father's company, her own house, and her own name on things that required nobody's permission. The people who are truly wealthy are not the ones who hold the most. They are the ones who can see what is in front of them without needing a price to tell them what it is worth.